The European Tour just banned Alex Eala, and within 48 hours, they reversed every single word of that decision. Not quietly, not with a polite statement buried in a press release, a full, public, humiliating reversal, forced by sponsors, triggered by fan fury, and witnessed by millions of people across 6 continents who had been watching this moment build for months. Nobody in professional tennis had seen anything quite like it. A governing body making a decision, announcing it with authority, and then collapsing under the weight of commercial and cultural pressure faster than almost any institution in modern sport has ever collapsed before. But here is what the headlines missed entirely. Here is what the ticker tape announcements and the breaking news alerts did not explain. This was never just about a scheduling dispute. This was never just about wild cards or court assignments or tournament slots. This was about something far older, far deeper, and far more consequential, about who women's tennis belongs to, about whose fans matter, about which players deserve to stand on the stages that this sport has been building for decades. And when the European Tour tried to answer that question by shutting Alex Eala out, the entire commercial world gave them an answer they will not forget for a very long time. Stay until the end, because this story reveals something about power in professional tennis that nobody is saying loudly enough. To understand why this erupted the way it did, you first need to understand precisely what Alex Eala represents, not just to the Philippines, not just to Asian tennis, but to the entire architecture of women's sport globally. She was born on May 23, 2005, in Quezon City. She left the Philippines at 13 years old, moved to Majorca, and trained at the Rafael Nadal Academy while most children her age were still figuring out who they wanted to be. That sacrifice, that specific, irreversible decision to leave home and chase a dream that nobody around her could fully see yet, became the foundation of a story that resonated across demographics and geographies in a way that very few athletic narratives have ever achieved. By 2025, the results began matching the sacrifice at a velocity that stunned everyone in professional tennis. As a wild card at the Miami Open, she defeated Madison Keys, the reigning Australian Open champion. She defeated Iga Swiatek, the 5-time Grand Slam winner and former world number 1 in the quarterfinals. She reached the semifinals. She won her first WTA 125 title in Guadalajara. She reached the quarterfinal in Dubai, losing only to Coco Gauff. By March 16, 2026, her WTA singles ranking sat at a career-high world number 29, the highest any Filipino athlete had ever climbed in the history of the WTA Tour. But the numbers, extraordinary as they are, only tell half the story. The other half lives in the stands. Eala had quickly become one of the most popular players in the sport, drawing hordes of fans, many experiencing professional tennis for the very first time, to tournaments around the world. Her matches generated scenes that tournament directors described as unlike anything they had witnessed in decades of organizing professional tennis events. Long lines had already formed outside Stadium 3 6 hours before the start of her second-round match at Indian Wells, with hundreds of enthusiastic fans holding Filipino flags and wearing shirts that read Alexandra Eala Fan Club. A day-in-the-life video featuring Eala posted to the BNP Paribas Open's official YouTube channel became the tournament's most viewed content of the entire 2026 event, and it wasn't close. Tournament organizers had, on multiple occasions, failed to capitalize on her popularity, scheduling her at strange times and on smaller courts, a pattern that had been building quiet resentment within Eala's global fan base for months before it finally detonated. This was the landscape. This was the pressure system forming silently over women's tennis. And into that pressurized environment, the European Tour made a decision that ignited it all. You think you know where this is going. You don't. Keep watching, because what the European Tour actually did was far more calculated than a simple ban. It began, as so many institutional mistakes begin, with a policy document. The European Tour, the consortium of WTA events staged across the continent during the clay and grass seasons, had been quietly revising its wildcard allocation framework for the 2026 European swing. The document, drafted by tournament directors across multiple events, including clay court tournaments in Madrid, Rome, and the grass court swing through Birmingham and Eastbourne, proposed a new structural restriction on wildcard eligibility for players ranked outside the top 25 who had received more than 3 wildcard entries across their career from management-affiliated organizations. On paper, the language was neutral, administrative, bureaucratic in the particular way that consequential decisions always hide themselves behind administrative language. In practice, it targeted one player more directly than any other name on the tour, Alex Eala. In total, the Filipina had entered 12 events as a wildcard across her career. IMG, the management company that also runs several WTA events, including the Miami Open and Madrid Open, had helped give Alex Eala her WTA 1000 debuts by offering wildcards to both tournaments before her ranking justified an appearance. Under the new European framework, this history of management-affiliated wildcard access triggered the proposed restriction automatically. The result, Alex Eala would effectively be blocked from receiving wildcard entries at multiple European tournaments during the 2026 clay season, including events where she had already been informally expected to participate and where tournament marketing materials had already, in some cases, begun referencing her potential appearance. When the decision leaked, and in professional tennis, decisions of this magnitude always leak, the reaction was immediate and seismic.
The debate that had been simmering around Eala's growing fan base and its impact on other players suddenly found new combustible fuel. Critics of the policy pointed out that the wildcard history cited in the restriction was standard practice for virtually every developing young talent in the sport. Supporters of the policy argued that preferential treatment from a management company that simultaneously operated tournaments represented a genuine conflict requiring structural correction. Both arguments had merit. Neither argument mattered once the fans found out. What happens when 12 million Filipino diaspora fans across Europe discover their favorite player has been shut out of the tournaments they already bought tickets to attend? The reaction did not build gradually. It detonated. Within 6 hours of the policy document circulating through tennis media, Filipino fan communities across Europe, organized, passionate, and deeply connected through social media networks that had been strengthened by 2 years of collective Eala watching, had coordinated a response that no tournament director had a framework to anticipate. Ticket cancellation notices began arriving at European tournament box offices in numbers that paralyzed their booking systems. Madrid, Rome, Birmingham, Eastbourne, the events that had been explicitly or implicitly referenced in the wildcard restriction framework, began receiving withdrawal requests from Filipino fan groups who had, in many cases, organized travel packages, hotel bookings, and group ticket purchases specifically around Eala's anticipated participation. The financial mathematics were stark and immediately visible. Eala's matches were almost always sold out, and tournament organizers recognized that having Eala's fans in and around the grounds far outweighed any costs associated with accommodating her participation. One tournament director had publicly stated they would do anything to have her at their event, a sentiment that now read as darkly ironic given what the institutional framework had just attempted. But the fan response was only the first wave. The second wave came from sponsors. Nike, whose relationship with Eala had deepened significantly through 2025 and 2026, culminating in the now iconic Sampaguita hair tie gifted for her Wimbledon debut, and the limited edition Nike shirt designed by Filipino artist Georgina Camus, communicated privately but unmistakably to European tournament partners that the policy created unacceptable complications for their athlete and their brand. Babolat, whose pure arrow racket Eala had wielded through every match of her breakthrough season, issued no public statement but made their position clear through commercial channels. Smart Sports, Globe Telecom, Milo, Filipino brands whose European marketing strategies had been completely restructured around Eala's continental appearances began conversations with their own sponsorship partners about the implications of her absence. The pressure arrived from every direction, simultaneously: commercial, cultural, and deeply personal. Eala herself had previously spoken carefully about the scrutiny and pressure that surrounded her growing profile, saying, "I am learning to deal with a lot of these cameras, and a lot of the times when people see me, the phone is the first thing they reach out for." But this was different. This wasn't scrutiny of her character or her behavior. This was institutional exclusion, and the world watching it happen was not prepared to stay silent. The sponsors had spoken. The fans had spoken. But had the European tour made a mistake it couldn't walk back? Or was there something even darker underneath this decision? By the time 48 hours had elapsed since the policy document leaked, the European tour found itself in a position that institutional bodies dread above almost anything else: a position of visible, public, commercially catastrophic isolation. The social media environment around the story had reached a scale that dwarfed previous tennis controversies. The Australian Open crowd controversy, where spectators were loudly cheering the errors of opponent Alicia Parks, generating debate about whether Filipino fans had crossed tennis etiquette lines. This was different. This was a discussion about institutional discrimination, and the framing had hardened rapidly across every platform. Former players weighed in. Tennis commentators who had spent months celebrating Eala's rise now turned their microphones toward the question whether professional tennis was structurally capable of accommodating a player whose commercial and cultural footprint operated on a scale the sport hadn't encountered before. Coco Gauff had even acknowledged the power of Eala's fan base during their Dubai match, apologizing in her post-match interview about how long Eala's supporters had been waiting. That moment of grace between competitors now contrasted sharply with the institutional coldness of the European framework. The political dimension, always present but rarely explicit in professional tennis, could no longer be ignored. The Philippines' 12 million-strong diaspora across Europe represented a voting constituency, a consumer base, and a cultural community with genuine political influence in multiple European nations. Ambassadors made calls. Cultural attachés drafted communications. The story moved from sports pages to news sections in ways that made European tournament directors profoundly uncomfortable. And then came the press conference that nobody had scheduled. A senior figure within the European Tournament Consortium appeared before cameras without advance notice and delivered a statement that attempted to clarify the policy's intent, but which instead revealed the fundamental failure of institutional thinking that had created the crisis. The language was defensive, technical, and utterly disconnected from the emotional reality of what millions of people watching had experienced. It satisfied nobody. It convinced nobody, and it gave the story another 48 hours of oxygen precisely when the institution desperately needed it to suffocate. The scheduling dynamics around Eala had already generated controversy weeks earlier, with analysts noting that moving her match to open sessions risked leaving other players performing in near-empty stands, something that might not have happened under different circumstances. That earlier controversy had established a pattern. Every institutional decision involving Eala's placement or participation now landed in a pre-charged environment where audiences searched immediately for evidence of bias, preferential treatment in reverse, or simple failure to understand what this player meant to global women's tennis. The European Tour had walked directly into that environment without a map. Drop a comment. Do you think this was genuine policy reform or deliberate gatekeeping? Because the answer changes everything about what came next.
On the third day, the European Tour reversed course entirely. The formal announcement arrived through official WTA channels simultaneously with a statement from the European Tournament Consortium, a coordinated communication clearly designed to minimize the appearance of institutional retreat while making the substance of the reversal as complete as possible. The wildcard restriction framework, as applied to players with management-affiliated entry histories, would be suspended pending a full structural review. Alex Eala's participation eligibility at European Tour events for the 2026 season remained unchanged. Existing marketing materials referencing her potential participation were confirmed as accurate. Ticket purchases made in anticipation of her appearances remained valid. The reversal was total. The language was careful. The humiliation for those within the institution who had championed the original policy was absolute. But what drove the reversal beyond the fan fury and the sponsor pressure? What specific calculation made the decision-makers within the European Tour conclude within 72 hours that their position was structurally untenable? The answer lives in a number that tournament directors understand better than any ranking or prize money figure: broadcast value. Eala had almost 1 million followers on Instagram, more than double that of high-ranking players like Jessica Pegula, Madison Keys, and Amanda Anisimova combined. European broadcast partners whose rights agreements with the WTA Tour included performance metrics tied to viewership, digital engagement, and live attendance had communicated, privately but with absolute clarity, that Eala's exclusion from European events during the 2026 clay and grass seasons represented a material breach of the commercial expectations embedded in those agreements. This was not an abstract conversation about fairness or representation. This was a contractual conversation about money. And when the lawyers began examining what Eala's absence from Madrid, Rome, Birmingham, and Eastbourne actually meant in broadcast revenue terms, the mathematical reality made the policy decision impossible to sustain. Eala had already made history. She was the first Filipino to earn automatic entry into all 4 Grand Slam main draws. She had transcended the wildcard question entirely through the force of her own ranking and performance. The policy the European Tour had constructed was, in a very specific legal sense, targeting historical access patterns that no longer reflected her current standing. Her attorneys communicated this clearly. The WTA communicated it even more clearly. And the broadcast partners communicated it in the only language that institutional bodies ultimately understand: financial consequence. The reversal happened because it had to, not because the institution grew a conscience, not because the fan outcry moved them emotionally, because the commercial architecture of modern professional tennis had been built, whether intentionally or accidentally, in a way that made Alex Eala's exclusion economically indefensible. And that, perhaps, is the most significant truth this entire episode revealed. 72 horas, pero la conversación que inició durará años. He aquí por qué. What does a 72-hour ban, reversed under commercial pressure, actually mean for the long-term architecture of women's tennis? It means that the sport has arrived at a moment of reckoning it has been building toward since Alex Eala first walked onto a professional court as a wild card and started winning matches she had no business winning by any conventional expectation. A moment where the institutions that govern tennis, the tournament directors, the scheduling committees, the wildcard frameworks, the broadcast allocation structures, must confront a fundamental question about their own design. Those institutions were built for a certain kind of tennis world, a world where the sport's commercial center of gravity sat firmly in Europe and North America, a world where the most commercially powerful players came from established tennis nations with established tennis infrastructure and established relationships with the institutional frameworks that govern the sport. A world where a 20-year-old from the Philippines ranked world number 29 and climbing did not exist. That world is gone. Alex Eala is, by multiple measurements, the most famous player in women's tennis right now.
Not the best, not yet, by Grand Slam metrics, but the most magnetic, the most culturally significant, the most commercially powerful per unit of institutional resistance she encounters. She has earned a wild card to any event that wanted one, not through management connections, but through the simple, overwhelming fact that her presence fills stadiums, sells tickets, and generates broadcast numbers that no tournament director can afford to ignore. Her own words, spoken months before any of this erupted, captured something prophetic. "My dreams have come true," she posted after the 2025 season concluded. "I have no words to describe what this year has brought me." And when asked about 2026 and beyond, she simply said, "Maybe 2027 will be even better." That quiet confidence, that absolute, unshakable belief in a trajectory that the numbers entirely support, is what makes the European Tour's attempted restriction so revealing in retrospect. You don't try to restrict something that isn't powerful enough to threaten you. The very fact that the policy was constructed, that it was aimed with such precise specificity at wildcard histories that effectively described one player's career path, revealed something the institution never intended to reveal. They were afraid of what she was becoming, and they were right to pay attention, just wrong about what to do with that attention. Daria Seville said it with a directness that cut through every institutional euphemism. "If I was a tournament director, I would do anything for her to be at my tournament." That sentiment, freely expressed by a fellow professional who understood the commercial and cultural reality of Eala's presence, represented the authentic voice of women's tennis responding to what the institutional framework had tried and catastrophically failed to suppress. The ban lasted 72 hours. The reversal came swiftly. The lesson landed permanently. Women's tennis is not the same sport it was when its current institutional frameworks were designed. The center of gravity is shifting towards Asia, towards Southeast Asia specifically, towards a 20-year-old from Quezon City who moved to Mallorca at 13 and refused in every match and every press conference and every public moment since to be anything less than exactly what she came to professional tennis to become. The European Tour will run its events. The clay season will arrive. Alex Eala will play in Madrid and Rome and on the grass of Birmingham and Eastbourne, because the commercial reality of women's tennis in 2026 makes her absence from those courts not just unfair, but structurally impossible to sustain. And somewhere in the quiet machinery of those tournament operations, the directors who drafted that policy document will watch her play under lights that sell out every stadium she enters, and they will understand, perhaps for the first time with absolute clarity, exactly what they were dealing with. Was this a policy dispute, a scheduling controversy, a power struggle between old institutional thinking and new global commercial reality? Or was this the moment women's tennis finally admitted under pressure it could not resist that the future had already arrived, and her name was Alex Eala? Leave your answer below, because this debate has only just begun.